There is a kind of power that only works in the dark, not the power of someone who gives speeches, signs contracts under their own name, shows up in the papers with a smile. The other kind, the power of someone who moves pieces on a board that no one else can see. In San Francisco in the 1870s and 1880s, there was a woman like that. You could watch her pass through the streets in an elegant carriage, driven by a coachman in a black coat and immaculate white trousers. The kind of equipage that belonged to senators, to silver mine magnates, to men whose names were cut into the stone of bank façades. Who was the woman inside? Most people could not tell you. That was exactly the point. Behind a façade she had built over decades, Mary Ellen Pleasant had accumulated the equivalent of nearly $1 billion in today's money. As the silent partner of one of California's most powerful bankers, running a household that was hers in everything but name, while the man who would become California's next governor was sleeping in one of her buildings. Politicians told their secrets at her dinner table. She financed one of the most consequential acts of defiance in American history, and she died almost penniless in a borrowed room on a borrowed bed. The problem with power that lives in the shadows is this. When someone decides to turn off the light, you cannot prove it was ever yours. This is the story of a woman who built an impossible empire, and of how that same empire was used to destroy her. Chapter 1. A name designed to disappear. Nobody knows for certain where Mary Ellen Pleasant was born. She kept multiple versions of the story, and she deployed them strategically. In the autobiography she dictated on her deathbed, she claimed to have been born free in Philadelphia on August 19, 1814, the daughter of a Hawaiian merchant who imported silk from India and a black woman from Louisiana. Other sources say she was from Georgia, born into slavery, that the year was 1817, that her parents were different people entirely, the story a different story. For a long time, historians tried to solve this as if it were a mistake to be corrected. It was no mistake. It was the first lesson of her life. Your origins are information, and information in the wrong hands can get you killed. She grew up in a world where being correctly identified could mean being dragged back into slavery, where a name, a birthplace, a recognizable face could be the difference between freedom and chains. From early on, she had worked out that the best protection is not a wall, it is fog. When she was around 6 years old, she was sent to Nantucket, Massachusetts, to live with a Quaker family called Hussey. Her father left enough money for her to be educated. The Husseys spent that money on something else. They noticed she had a natural talent for commerce, a perfect memory, ease with strangers, the ability to make any customer feel attended to, and put her behind the counter of the family store. Her own account of this, told decades later, had the specificity of someone who never forgot anything. She never set foot in a school for a single day of her life. Decades later, already old and known throughout the city, she would say, "I often wonder what I would have been with an education." Then add, in that dry tone that was entirely hers, "But I let books alone and studied men and women a good deal. When I have something to say, people listen. They never go to sleep on me." Nantucket was where she actually formed herself. Not in grammar or mathematics, but in the kind of reading that has no textbook. What people want before they know they want it, what a silence means, what someone is hiding in the smallest gesture. On the same island, she came into contact with abolitionism. Nantucket was a Quaker stronghold with deep anti-slavery roots, and the Husseys were part of that world. She absorbed the politics, but she did more than absorb them. She took them personally in a way that would never let go of her. Still young, she moved to Boston. She worked as a tailor's apprentice on Merrimack Street, and there she met James Smith, landowner, contractor, abolitionist. They married in the early 1840s and turned their home into a stop on the Underground Railroad. Routes organized, people hidden, crossings coordinated through Nantucket and New Bedford toward Canada. The Fugitive Slave Act made it a federal crime. They did it anyway. When Smith died in 1844, he left her $15,000, well over $600,000 in today's money, and a condition that read less like a legal clause and more like a final instruction. Keep going. She kept going. For some years, she continued running underground railroad routes along the eastern seaboard, pushing further into territory that had grown genuinely dangerous. At some point, she passed through New Orleans, where she learned to cook at a level that would matter later, and where she came into contact with Vodun, the spiritual tradition her family had carried from West Africa, not as something exotic, as something hers. But New Orleans was also where the danger caught up. She was on the verge of arrest. She needed to disappear. California was calling everyone. She left with that money, with decades of practice in not being seen, and a cause she would carry for the rest of her life. She sailed as Ellen Smith. She arrived as someone else, always someone else. But what she found on the other side of the ocean would change everything. Chapter 2. $500 for a cook. San Francisco in 1852 was not quite a city. It was a geographical accident that had gone mad. In 4 years, since gold was found at Coloma, a fishing village had turned into a metropolis of wet timber, mud, smoke, and money in quantities that broke any prior logic. Enough wealth to make people believe the old rules had been suspended. They hadn't. For certain people, the old rules had doubled down. Mary Ellen Pleasant arrived in April 1852, aboard the steamship Oregon, after a crossing through Panama. She brought Smith's inheritance and a reputation that had preceded her. Somehow, men on the wharf already knew there was an exceptional cook on the ship. Before she had set foot on the dock, wealthy men were bidding for her services. The winning offer was $500, the highest price ever paid for a cook in the history of the city. Before she shook any hand, she laid out one condition. She would not wash clothes, not dishes, not anything. She cooked. That was the arrangement. Nobody pushed back. What most people around that table did not grasp, and Pleasant understood completely, is that cooking for powerful men in a world without privacy is one of the most advantageous positions that exist. You are in the room, you pour the wine, and while you do that, the men talk. They discuss which mine is about to pay out, which bank is overextended, which politician needs money and fast. They talk because you are not a person to them, you are furniture. Pleasant heard everything, and she invested on what she heard. The inheritance from Smith was spread across several banks, lent at interest to black business owners in the city, converted between gold and silver as rates shifted. She opened laundries, 3, in succession, each one larger, not glamorous, not the kind of thing anyone wrote about. But they produced steady money, year after year, without drawing any attention to who was collecting it. For safety, she registered in the city directories as Mrs. Ellen Smith. Her white neighbors saw a reliable housekeeper. The black community saw something else entirely. They called her Black City Hall. If you needed help, a job, legal representation, the money for a relative's passage west, you went to Mary Ellen Pleasant. She brought people from Ohio, from Cleveland, from Boston, paid their way herself, helped them find work once they arrived. No office, no budget, just her. In 1865, she made a quiet decision that marked a real shift. For the first time since arriving in California, she marked black on the federal census. After 13 years of strategic ambiguity, she had decided it was time to stop hiding in public. From that point on, she began acting more openly in the causes she had long supported in silence. The following year, in October 1866, she tried to board a North Beach and Mission Railroad streetcar. The driver did not stop. There was room. She had the ticket. He simply didn't stop. She sued. That same day, a laundress named Emma Jane Turner filed against the same company for the same reason, most likely a coordinated move. Pleasant also went after a second company, the Omnibus Railroad, which backed down quickly and promised to change its policy. The second case went to the California Supreme Court in 1868. On the stand, Pleasant testified that she had suffered greatly in body and mind from being made to walk. The language was deliberate. Invoking the physical suffering of a black woman at that particular moment in history called on associations the court was obligated to confront. The Supreme Court reversed the decision. Insufficient proof that the driver's motivation was racial. She had the ticket in her hand. Pleasant understood that the courts were not a reliable path. What you could build, instead, was enough power that using the courts against you cost more than it was worth. But before getting to the empire she built, there is a story that happened in between, one that most accounts skip past in a sentence, but that deserves more than that. In January 1858, a man named Archie Lee was arrested in Sacramento. Lee had been brought from Mississippi by a slaveholder named Charles Stovall. The law technically permitted slaveholders to pass through California with enslaved people if they were only passing through. Stovall had stayed for over a year, renting Lee's labor to others before deciding to return south. Lee ran. San Francisco's black community, fewer than 400 people, mobilized immediately. Money was raised for lawyers. A committee formed, 7 men, 7 women. Pleasant was one of them. The lawyer won the first round. Lee wasn't the slave of a traveler. He was the slave of a resident. Stovall had no legal claim. Then the California Supreme Court intervened. The presiding judge was Peter Burnett, the former governor who had once tried to ban black people from entering the state altogether. Burnett agreed with the legal argument, and then issued a ruling so extraordinary it is still hard to read without stopping. He granted Stovall leniency because the slaveholder was young, inexperienced, and in fragile health. Lee was arrested a second time. What happened in the days that followed is something you don't see written about much. Black maritime workers, cooks, stewards, longshoremen, sailors, organized overnight watches on the San Francisco wharves in rotating shifts. The fear was that Stovall would try to move Lee out by sea before a new legal move could be made. Black-owned businesses closed their doors. San Francisco's black community went on alert. Stovall tried to flee. He was caught and arrested for kidnapping. Federal Commissioner reversed the Supreme Court. Archie Lee went free permanently. It was the last fugitive slave case in California's history. And when the legal danger had passed, but the physical danger hadn't, Pleasant hid Lee in her own home, then helped him get to Canada. That was what Black City Hall actually meant. Chapter 3, $30 million and a Secret. At 920 Washington Street, on a lot she had acquired years earlier by paying off the mortgage of a defaulting owner, Pleasant built the most exclusive boarding house in San Francisco. Not the most comfortable or the largest. The most exclusive, which in San Francisco in the 1870s meant something specific. It meant the governor of California lived there and was elected from inside its walls. Newton Booth was in residence when he won in September 1871. The Examiner tried to turn this into a scandal, implying that a man who lodged with a black woman had questionable moral character. Booth's career survived the implication. The men kept coming. They kept talking. She kept taking notes. The network she was building had no name and no address. It ran on information, on knowing what was about to happen before the papers announced it, which land deal was being closed in private, which bank was in trouble before the depositors knew. She put money into precious metals, mines, properties, and stocks, always through other people's names, always without appearing in any document herself. It was in this context that Thomas Bell entered the picture. Bell was Scottish, a banker, vice president of the Bank of California. He had money and standing and a name that opened doors. But he also understood that the woman serving dinner to his colleagues knew more about the financial movements of the city than most people who were paid to track them. The arrangement they built together was practical. Bell provided the public face, the legal identity, the signature. Pleasant provided the intelligence, the judgment, and the capital. She moved the money. He signed the paperwork. The world saw Bell. The fortune grew on both sides. By 1875, it had reached $30 million. In today's terms, close to $900 million. With Bell came Teresa. Teresa Klingon was an orphan who had grown up on a farm in upstate New York without money or connections. Pleasant had helped her become someone, introduced her to the right people, taught her the social rhythms of a world she had been born outside of, helped place her as Mrs. Bell married into wealth that put her name in every drawing room in the city. Teresa wore dresses from Paris. She travelled in a private railway car. She received guests in rooms Pleasant had chosen the furniture for. What Teresa felt toward Pleasant was never entirely clear. What is clear is what the sources record without ambiguity. When Teresa needed money, she didn't ask her husband. She asked Pleasant. The woman Pleasant had made asked Pleasant for permission to spend. In 1877, Pleasant decided to build something that would say in stone and wood what the deeds in other people's names never could. She designed a mansion. 30 rooms crossed 2 full city blocks at Octavia and Bush Streets. $100,000 in construction. She chose every detail. The height of the ceilings, the angle of the windows, the fireplaces that could warm rooms large enough to seat 20. The furniture arrived in lots and was auctioned off every few years to make way for newer pieces, not because anything was worn out, but because Pleasant had standards that didn't stay still. Walnut bedroom suites, marble-topped sideboards, wall-to-wall carpets. The house of someone who had arrived. The deed was in Bell's name. Pleasant moved in as housekeeper. The newspapers called it the House of Mystery, and never quite settled on why. A black woman listed as housekeeper in a house like that was an equation that wouldn't balance, no matter which way they turned it. On the pavement that year, she planted 6 eucalyptus trees with her own hands. Large, deep-rooted, built to survive long past anything else she was building. But before talking about what came next, it is necessary to go back to something that had happened nearly 20 years before the mansion existed. Something the newspapers never learned, that no court ever proved. That Pleasant kept to herself until she was almost gone, and that she considered the most important thing she had ever done, more than any fortune. Chapter 4. The Letter in John Brown's Pocket. In 1858, Pleasant had laundries, a network, and a reputation. The mansion was still 20 years away. Bell was still a stranger. The $30 million did not yet exist. But she had something no amount of money had bought her. A cause she was prepared to bet everything on. She packed her bags and went east. John Brown was, at that moment, the most dangerous name in the United States. A radical abolitionist, a man who read the Bible and concluded that slavery would only end when someone forced it to, through armed uprising, starting at the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry in Virginia. The enslaved would rise. The slave-holding states would be overwhelmed. The war that everyone could feel coming would arrive ahead of schedule on his terms. Brown needed money. Pleasant had it. She arrived in Chatham, in what is now Ontario, Canada, a city with a strong black population, a terminus of the Underground Railroad, the operational center of North American abolitionist organizing. Brown had called a secret meeting there, which he termed a provisional constitutional convention. He was building the legal structure of a nation that didn't exist yet, but that he planned to force into existence. Pleasant walked in with $30,000, over $1 million in today's money. Built through years of work, intelligence gathered at dinner tables, investments made before the market caught up. She handed it all over. Money was the easy part. In the months that followed, before the planned raid, she traveled through the interior of the southern states disguised as a jockey, horseback, blending in among plantation workers, sleeping in the quarters of enslaved people, passing word in low voices about what was coming. Her job was to have a network ready, people who would rise when Brown struck, simultaneously, in every direction, making any organized response impossible. Brown struck in October 1859. He went early, before the network was ready, before the word had spread far enough. He started the raid on Harper's Ferry before the time was ripe. I was astounded when I heard that he had started in and was beaten and captured, and that the affair upon which I had staked my money and built so much hope was a fiasco. She said that more than 40 years later, on her deathbed, and the pain was still there. Not the money. The proximity to something she had believed in completely. When Brown was taken, the authorities found a letter in his coat pocket. Written in a cramped, irregular hand, Pleasant admitted freely that her handwriting was never good. The letter said, "The axe is laid at the root of the tree. When the first blow is struck, there will be more money and help." Signed with the writer's initials. The initials were MEP. The men searching Brown read them as WEP. The investigation went the wrong way. No one named Wep was found. No Mary Ellen Pleasant was arrested, tried, or sent to the gallows, as Brown was in December 1859. The woman who had financed the most audacious act of organized resistance in American history walked away clean, saved by her own bad penmanship. Near the end of her life, she finally told the full story to Sam Davis, the journalist she had trusted with her memoirs. She laid out everything: the disguise, the money, the letter, the plan that collapsed before it could be executed. And she was direct about what she wanted said. The money had always been a means. The cause was the thing. Chapter 5. What they called her. Pleasant came back from everything surrounding Harper's Ferry and returned to San Francisco as if nothing had changed. Because as far as anyone knew, nothing had. Wep was somebody else's problem. The city knew her as an excellent cook with a talent for business. For 20 more years, that held. What broke it wasn't a crime, it was a trial. The Sharon case, formerly Sharon versus Sharon, was a dispute between a woman named Sarah Althea Hill and Senator William Sharon over what their relationship actually was. Sharon paid Hill $500 a month. His position was that this was a paid arrangement, nothing more. Hill said it was a secret marriage, kept quiet for political reasons but legally binding. The two readings were not close. If Hill was right, Sharon owed her a great deal, more than $500 a month. Pleasant paid Hill's legal fees. She had done the same thing dozens of times, put money behind people who couldn't defend themselves in a system that hadn't been designed for them. But this time the opponent was a United States senator, and a senator with Sharon's money and grievances was a different kind of enemy. The San Francisco press, which had never quite figured out how to categorize Pleasant, finally found what it was looking for. On May 1, 1884, the Examiner called her Mammy Pleasance for the first time. Mammy. The word has a specific and ugly history in the United States. It describes the loyal, smiling domestic slave, devoted, harmless, incapable of menace. An archetype built to make black women in service positions seem natural, inevitable, and safe. Attaching that word to Mary Ellen Pleasant, capitalist, Underground Railroad operative, the person who had personally bankrolled John Brown's rebellion, was not an accident. It was a decision, the name stuck, and the stories multiplied. She had poisoned Sharon. She had spelled the undergarments of powerful men. She ran a baby trading operation. The press printed these things without sources, without evidence, without any apparent concern for consequence, because destroying a black woman's reputation in 1884, San Francisco carried none. What Pleasant actually practiced was Vodun, the African-rooted religion she had inherited from her family. Real, meaningful hers. The press took that and made it into tabloid theatre. San Francisco's voodoo queen. It moved papers. It cost her years of work. What she did in response was not what anyone expected. She started carrying a crystal ball to public appearances, a provocation, a way of saying, "You want a witch, watch closely, charge me if you can." When reporters asked about the headlines, she was unmoved. The newspapers needed to pay their workers. If writing about her kept people employed, fine. If they lay my character down in the middle of the road and let the whole world jump on it, that is fine. So long as my friends believe in me, I don't care. And in a phrase she returned to more than once, "I would rather be a corpse than a coward." On the witness stand during the Sharon proceedings, she was, by every contemporary account, composed, precise and consistent, nothing like what the papers had been promising. The next day's headlines had nothing to do with what she had actually said. Judge Stephen Field ruled for Sharon. Hill's attorney, David Terry, who had married her during the trial, broke down when the verdict came, spent 6 months in jail for contempt, and was shot dead in 1889 by a bodyguard that Judge Field had hired for his own protection. The case ruined everyone it touched. Pleasant left it with her reputation destroyed in print and largely intact in person. For years that had been an acceptable trade. But the newspapers were read every morning by Teresa Bell. And Teresa Bell was keeping score. Chapter 6. The Staircase. In the early hours of October 16, 1892, Thomas Bell left his bedroom in the dark. What happened next was never settled. Bell fell, 2 floors, down the main staircase of the house that Pleasant had designed, paid for, and lived in for 15 years. He died from a head injury a few hours later. Accident or something else. The press chose the second before any investigation had begun and ran Mammy Pleasant in the first line without bothering with evidence. What matters is not the staircase. What matters is what Teresa Bell did next. She woke that morning as Bell's widow with his name, his children legally recognized in the will, and a fortune that dwarfed anything she had ever been allowed to hold directly. And with 20 years of resentment against the woman who had built everything in this house, and who, as Teresa saw it, had controlled everyone in it for far too long. The orchid that Pleasant had cultivated had decided to take the garden. Teresa sued Pleasant for theft. She accused her of manipulating Bell over years, diverting money, keeping her husband under a kind of influence he couldn't escape. The press, which had spent a decade constructing the figure of Mammy Pleasant, didn't need to be convinced. The courts went to work, and here is where the trap closed. Everything Pleasant had built was tangled up in Bell's name. The properties, the investments, the assets. She had structured it this way out of necessity. A black woman in the 19th century could not hold title to anything substantial without immediately becoming a target. The invisibility had been a survival tool for 30 years. Now she needed to prove what was hers, and the paperwork said Bell. The deeds said Bell. The contracts carried Bell's signature. The shields she had chosen, intermediaries, trusted friends, proxies, had no record of acting on her behalf. She had built an empire that couldn't prove it existed. When the wind changed, that empire became nothing. The courts couldn't separate Pleasant's assets from the Bells. She was declared insolvent. The mansion she had designed and paid for was transferred to Teresa Bell. No theft needed to be proved. Only the absence of any proof that she had owned anything in the first place. That absence Pleasant had built herself. Chapter 7. The Veranda. In April 1899, Mary Ellen Pleasant left the Octavia Street mansion for the last time. Teresa Bell had asked her to go. Pleasant packed what she could carry and left. She was in her mid-80s. She went to Geneva Cottage, the small property at San Jose and Geneva Avenues in the Ingleside neighborhood. The land where she had built her first laundry back in the 1850s, the oldest piece of everything she had assembled, and now the last one still genuinely in her hands. In July 1899, a reporter from the San Francisco Chronicle came out to interview her. The piece was not kind. Teresa Bell almost certainly had something to do with how it was framed. The journalist had a personal grudge against Pleasant, and the timing was not coincidental. But the visit left one thing behind that no amount of bad faith could erase: the only known photograph of Geneva Cottage taken that day. A small, grainy image with the veranda at its center, and standing on it, barely visible, a dark figure against pale wood. Mary Ellen Pleasant, 84 years old, still on her feet. She sold Geneva Cottage in 1900 for $7,500. Creditors were pressing. The land where everything began went for a fraction of what it had been worth. A streetcar depot was built on the site. She still had one thing left to do. Her memoirs, dictated to Sam Davis, a journalist who had been her friend for decades, one of the few people who had stayed close regardless of how much or how little she had. The first installment appeared in January 1902. It read exactly like her, direct, sharp, unapologetic. The second installment was never published. The editorial note in the next issue of the Pandex of the Press said only that there had been a misunderstanding between author and editor and that the memoirs were discontinued. Subscribers who had signed on specifically for them could request their money back. The rumor, unproved but never convincingly dismissed, was that Teresa Bell bought the magazine through a proxy for the sole purpose of shutting the second installment down. The installment in which Pleasant would presumably have said what she actually knew about the Bells, about 50 years of wealthy San Francisco families and their secrets, the things she had promised to carry to her grave, but which by then she may no longer have felt obligated to protect. She had told Davis, "The best that I know will be given to the public. The worst will be buried with me." The worst was buried. The second installment with it. Her last years were spent in a rented apartment on Webster Street, and then in the home of her friend Olive Sherwood on Filbert Street. Small, simple, borrowed. The Bell children, the ones she had helped raise, still came to see her. A reporter offered good money for stories about the city's powerful families. She turned it down. Not because she needed the money less than she ever had, but because she had not betrayed anyone in 80-odd years and was not starting now. On January 11, 1904, Mary Ellen Pleasant died. Almost no money. Friends around her, not a fortune. Before she went, she left one request: that her headstone read she was a friend of John Brown, not entrepreneur, not capitalist. Not the mother of civil rights in California, the title that came later. The friend of John Brown. The act she had done in complete secrecy, which had cost more than $1 million and nearly cost her life, which the authorities never connected to her name. That was what she wanted on the stone, not the money, the cause. At Tulakoke Cemetery in Napa, the headstone says exactly that. And at the corner of Octavia and Bush Streets in San Francisco, where the mansion was demolished decades after her death, 5 eucalyptus trees are still standing. 5 of the 6 she planted with her own hands in 1877, when the world was still wide open. They became a city landmark in 1974, the smallest park in San Francisco, the only piece of that empire that nobody managed to take. She planted them because she knew trees outlast everything else. They outlast mansions. They outlast fortunes. They outlast the names the press invented for her. And they outlast, as it turns out, the silence that was supposed to follow.